This city was built like the danger would come back, not for a passing disaster, but for something they expected to return. 18 levels carved straight into the earth, nearly 300 feet below the surface where sunlight cannot reach. A city large enough to hide 20,000 people, sealed from the inside by 1,000-pound circular stone doors. In 1963, a man in Turkey knocked down a wall and discovered darkness that did not belong in a house. Passages widened into rooms, then staircases spiraling deeper. It wasn't a shelter, it was planned infrastructure. Ventilation shafts ran straight down, perfectly vertical, impossibly aligned with disturbing precision. Wells tapped into untouched aquifers, while storage chambers for thousands sat beside animal pens. This was a city built to disappear and remain gone for as long as necessary. The intention was unmistakable, and that still isn't the disturbing part. When archaeologists finished mapping the tunnels, the numbers stopped feeling historical and started feeling wrong. Derinkuyu required the removal of nearly 2.5 million cubic feet of solid volcanic rock. That is not a basement. That is not a cellar. That is industrial-scale excavation without industry. That is not a basement. That is not a cellar. That is industrial-scale excavation without industry. That is not a basement. That is not a cellar. That is industrial-scale excavation without industry. And here is where it becomes uncomfortable, because there is no debris field, no quarry filled with displaced stone, no hills of discarded rock, no evidence of millions of cubic feet going anywhere, no quarry filled with displaced stone, no hills of discarded rock, no evidence of millions of cubic feet going anywhere, no quarry filled with displaced stone, no hills of discarded rock, no evidence of millions of cubic feet going anywhere. Every chamber you see below ground once existed as solid mass above it. Every chamber you see below ground once existed as solid mass above it, which means every corridor, every staircase, every ventilation shaft had to be carved, carried, and removed, which means every corridor, every staircase, every ventilation shaft had to be carved, carried, and removed with hand tools in darkness, generation after generation, with hand tools in darkness, generation after generation. Even if 100 workers labored every day, this would take decades. Even if 100 workers labored every day, this would take decades. And yet the layout is not chaotic. It is symmetrical, layered, engineered with foresight. And yet the layout is not chaotic. It is symmetrical, layered, engineered with foresight. The passages stretch for miles, connecting chambers that feel less like shelter and more like infrastructure. The passages stretch for miles, connecting chambers that feel less like shelter and more like infrastructure. Infrastructure implies planning, and planning implies expectation. Infrastructure implies planning, and planning implies expectation. Expectation of what? Because you do not commit this scale of labor to a passing inconvenience. Because you do not commit this scale of labor to a passing inconvenience. You do not carve 18 levels into the earth for raiders who come and leave within days. You do not carve 18 levels into the earth for raiders who come and leave within days. You do not design months of food storage and independent water for a short siege. You do not design months of food storage and independent water for a short siege. This is architecture built for duration. This is architecture built for duration, built for something that did not simply pass through history, but lingered, built for something that did not simply pass through history, but lingered. And when you begin to calculate the labor, the planning, the generational commitment required. And when you begin to calculate the labor, the planning, the generational commitment required, the question changes from how did they build this to why did they believe they had to. The question changes from how did they build this to why did they believe they had to. Because once you understand the scale, once you understand the missing stone, because once you understand the scale, once you understand the missing stone, once you understand the miles of deliberate passageways, once you understand the miles of deliberate passageways, you reach the same unavoidable conclusion. You reach the same unavoidable conclusion. You don't dig this for raiders. You don't dig this for raiders. You don't dig this for raiders. If the scale was disturbing, the ventilation system is where the logic begins to fracture. Derinkuyu contains more than 50 vertical shafts carved straight down through solid volcanic rock. Some of them plunge nearly 180 feet from the surface to the deepest levels, perfectly straight, perfectly aligned, without modern drilling equipment. To carve a shaft like this, you must begin at the surface and cut downward blindly into darkness, and as you descend, every piece of stone removed must be lifted back up through the same narrow opening, which means these shafts were not accidents. They were primary infrastructure, and without them, the city would suffocate. Oil lamps consume oxygen, bodies consume oxygen, animals consume oxygen. 20,000 people sealed beneath stone would exhaust breathable air in hours without circulation. So the shafts are not decorative, they are survival. Warm air rises through certain shafts. Cool air descends through others, creating natural circulation without machinery. That is not improvisation. That is understanding fluid dynamics centuries before the term existed. But here is the part that unsettles engineers even today. You do not build a ventilation network like this unless you expect prolonged occupancy. Ventilation is only necessary if you expect to stay. If you are hiding for a night, you do not need airflow calculated for thousands. If you are fleeing a short raid, you do not carve shafts nearly 200 feet deep. You invest that effort when you believe the outside world may remain uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps months. And when you combine the ventilation system with the storage chambers and the sealed doors, the city begins to look less like refuge and more like preparation. Because ventilation is not about hiding, it is about surviving below ground for as long as necessary. If the ventilation system kept them alive, the doors kept something else away. Each major corridor in Derinkuyu is guarded by a circular slab of carved stone, weighing close to a ton, 3 to 5 feet in diameter, thick enough to resist the impact, balanced enough to roll smoothly along a carved track. From the inside, a single person can move it. From the outside, it cannot be opened at all. There is no handle, no grip, no leverage point. Once it rolls shut, the passage becomes a wall. Stone grinding sound, and there are not 1 or 2 of these doors, but dozens. Each level segmented, each corridor divided, each fallback position isolated. This is not random defense. This is staged retreat architecture. If the upper level was breached, they could fall back and seal it. If the next corridor failed, they could retreat again and seal that too. Layer after layer, descending into deeper chambers, more protected chambers. But here is what makes the design unsettling. Each door contains a small circular opening, just wide enough for a spear, which means the defenders could strike without ever exposing themselves. But the attackers could not see them, could not reach them, could not move the door, This wasn't designed to keep enemies out. It was designed to trap something out. Silence. Because once sealed, the only direction left was down. Final beat. Once you move beyond the doors, the layout becomes something else entirely. The tunnels narrow, the ceilings drop. The walls begin to close in. In some sections you must bend, sometimes crawl. That is not accidental discomfort. That is tactical control of movement. A single defender can hold this space against many. The corridors twist sharply, preventing momentum, preventing formation. You cannot charge here. You can only advance slowly, blindly. Alcoves are carved into the walls, perfect for ambush. Murder holes pierce the ceilings, allowing defenders to strike from above. The deeper you go, the more complex the geometry becomes. Each level designed not to repel instantly, but to bleed intrusion slowly. You fall back one layer, seal it, regroup, and retreat again. This is not chaotic panic architecture. This is not a shelter. This is sustained siege engineering, protected by multiple sealed stone doors. This is sustained siege engineering, fade to black. It would be easier to dismiss Derinkuyu as a grand experiment if it had never been used. But the walls tell a different story. Blackened ceilings still carry the residue of thousands of oil lamps burning in confined air. Not from a single night, not from a brief hiding, but from prolonged habitation. The storage rooms contain carved grain bins worn smooth by repeated filling and emptying. Clay jars show handling marks, not ceremonial placement, but routine use. The wells show maintenance grooves where ropes repeatedly lowered buckets into darkness, and the stone doors carry polished tracks from movement over years. These doors did not close once and remain sealed forever. They rolled and rolled again. Generations maintained them, cleared debris from the tracks, preserved their function. The ventilation shafts remain structurally intact, still drawing air through ancient stone. The system was not abandoned. It was preserved. They didn't build this once. They maintained it. They maintained it. The most common explanation is simple. War. Hittites, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Mongols. Anatolia has seen invasion after invasion for thousands of years. So the theory goes, they built Derinkuyu to hide from armies. It sounds reasonable until you examine the scale. Armies do not conduct month-long sieges against invisible targets beneath solid rock. They burn crops. They loot surface homes. They move on. A raiding force cannot afford to wait weeks for people who have already vanished. A raiding force cannot afford to wait. And no ancient army carries the logistical capacity to excavate 18 levels of volcanic stone. They would have neither the tools nor the patience. They would have neither the tools nor the patience. If war were the primary threat, a fortress above ground would be more practical. Walls can be defended, towers provide visibility, supply lines remain accessible. But Derinkuyu is not a visible deterrent. It is an invisible disappearance. It is an invisible disappearance. Armies don't siege rock for months. Armies don't siege rock for months. Armies don't siege rock for months. Climate collapse is not fiction. History records years when the sun dimmed, crops failed, and temperatures fell without warning. In 536 CE, a volcanic winter darkened skies across continents. During the Bronze Age collapse, drought destabilized entire empires. Climate has destroyed civilizations before. It has happened before, so at first glance, an underground refuge makes sense. It provides safety. The earth offers stable temperature, protection from ash, shelter from wind. But climate collapse does not stalk corridors. It is silent. Drought does not force you to design kill zones. It is built for war, Ash does not require one-way locking stone doors, heavy, impenetrable. A volcanic winter does not demand spear ports. Behind barricades, if climate were the only threat, simple shelter would suffice. Just a place to hide. Derinkuyu is not simple shelter. It is something else. It is layered defense, segmented isolation, tactical retreat, designed for survival. Climate explains the refuge. It does not explain the barricades. There was something else they were hiding from. There is another explanation, one rarely discussed. There is another explanation, one rarely discussed. There is another explanation, one rarely discussed. Not invasion, not drought, not winter. Contamination, contamination, contamination. In the ancient world, disease moved invisibly, silently, without warning, without warning. You could not see it. You could not fight it. You could only avoid it. You could only avoid it. Now examine Derinkuyu through that lens. Now examine Derinkuyu through that lens. Now examine Derinkuyu through that lens. Water drawn from deep aquifers, unreachable from the surface, unreachable from the surface. Air filtered through vertical shafts, separated from open exposure, separated from open exposure. Levels that can be sealed independently, isolating one zone from another, isolating one zone from another. If illness entered one section, the others could survive. The others could survive. The architecture mirrors quarantine thinking. The architecture mirrors quarantine thinking. The architecture mirrors quarantine thinking. Close the door. Cut airflow. Control water. Wait, wait, wait. If contamination was the threat, this makes sense. If contamination was the threat, this makes sense. If contamination was the threat, this makes sense. But there is no inscription, no record, no confirmation, no confirmation. Derinkuyu is not alone. Derinkuyu is not alone. Derinkuyu is not alone. Beneath this landscape, there are dozens of underground cities. Beneath this landscape, there are dozens of underground cities. Beneath this landscape, there are dozens of underground cities. Kaymaklı, Özkonak, Mazı, some smaller, some partially collapsed, all engineered with similar defensive logic. In some cases, tunnels appear to extend between cities. In some cases, tunnels appear to extend between cities. In some cases, tunnels appear to extend between cities. Miles of carved passage through volcanic rock. Miles of carved passage through volcanic rock. Miles of carved passage through volcanic rock. Not isolated shelters, but a regional system. Not isolated shelters, but a regional system. Not isolated shelters, but a regional system. That suggests coordination. That suggests coordination. That suggests coordination. Shared knowledge. Shared knowledge. Shared knowledge. Shared expectation. Shared expectation. Shared expectation. Entire valleys preparing in the same way. Entire valleys preparing in the same way. Entire valleys preparing in the same way. You do not see that scale of preparation for isolated incidents. You do not see that scale of preparation for isolated incidents. You do not see that scale of preparation for isolated incidents. This is cultural memory carved into geology. This is cultural memory carved into geology. This is cultural memory carved into geology. Entire communities prepared for something. Entire communities prepared for something. Entire communities prepared for something. Not once, not briefly, but repeatedly. Not once, not briefly, but repeatedly. Not once, not briefly, but repeatedly. What matters most is not that Derinkuyu was built. What matters most is not that Derinkuyu was built. What matters is that it kept growing. What matters is that it kept growing. The earliest sections date back centuries before the deepest chambers were carved. The earliest sections date back centuries before the deepest chambers were carved. Different hands, different generations, Same direction. They did not abandon the system when danger passed. They did not abandon the system when danger passed. They maintained it. They maintained it. The tracks were cleared. The shafts remained open. The wells stayed functional. Stone does not polish itself. Stone does not polish itself. Doors do not wear down from imagination. Doors do not wear down from imagination. You only maintain infrastructure when you believe it will be needed again. You only maintain infrastructure when you believe it will be needed again. You only maintain infrastructure when you believe it will be needed again. That belief is not paranoia. That belief is not paranoia. It is memory. It is memory. Memory of something that did not happen once. Memory of something that did not happen once. Memory of something that did not happen once. Memory of something that returned. Memory of something that returned. Memory of something that returned. They expected it again. They expected it again. They expected it again. We have studied the tunnels, measured the depth, counted the doors, calculated the volume of rock removed, analyzed the ventilation and the wells. But there is one thing we cannot measure: the intensity of what they believed was coming. We don't know what they feared, but we know they never stopped fearing it. Because fear fades when threats disappear, infrastructure fades when danger does not return. Derinkuyu did not crumble. It was reinforced, expanded, maintained. For centuries, the surface changed. The surface changed. Empires rose. Empires rose. Empires rose. Empires collapsed. Empires collapsed. Empires collapsed. Languages vanished. Languages vanished. Languages vanished. Religions shifted. Religions shifted. Religions shifted. Generations passed. Generations passed. Generations passed. But beneath it all, nothing moved. But beneath it all, nothing moved. Nothing moved. The corridors remain carved. The corridors remain carved. The corridors remain carved. The ventilation shafts still breathe. The ventilation shafts still breathe. Still breathe. The water still rises from the aquifer. The water still rises from the aquifer. The doors still roll. The doors still roll. Still roll. The wells still flow. The wells still flow. Still flow. The city is still ready. The city is still ready. The city is still ready. And whatever they feared has never been fully explained. Never been fully explained.